Welcome to Hudson RPO's podcast on racial equality and diversity. Hear from Hudson RPO leaders as they encourage organizations to just start on their D&I journey.
So I'm Jeremiah Stone, and with me are my colleagues, Casey Butler, Mark Rogers, and Gary Jones. And I'm just going to set up our discussion today because we've actually had two of these already. And we've recorded two sessions, which were good or fine, depending on your perspective. But I think what we took away from these sessions, which were, I do think they were good and they were structured, and we wanted to make sure that we left people with some actionable takeaways. But I think the most actionable takeaway that we can give to an audience is to understand, like, how do you actually engage in conversation that might seem challenging or might seem fraught with peril, but like when you're having a conversation with colleagues that you trust and respect, that conversation becomes a lot easier. And I think that's what we've been able to do within this group. And it started a few weeks ago. We had originally planned on doing a podcast on other topics, and after the death of George Floyd and the resulting worldwide uprisings, we just individually and then collectively just made a determination that the most important thing that we could talk about was racial equity in the workplace. And Mark, if I can pick on you for a second, I think you, in our first collective conversation about that topic, you thought that was really impactful. And so I'll just ask if you wouldn't mind sharing what that experience looked like for you.
Yeah, I keep coming back to our first conversation as a leadership team on the topic, and but prior to that, we had each of us a number of conversations with our one-on-ones or as a team with our individual teams across the organization. And as a leader in those meetings, I felt it was my opportunity to do all the things that we've talked about, some of the things that we talked about in the last session, and that was to set the tone and have folks feel like they have an open forum where they can speak candidly and share their feelings and thoughts and so forth on the topic. And what I didn't get to mention in the last session was how that happened when we came together as a leadership team. So America's CEO and the rest of the executive leadership team, all of you and so forth. And it really was just an organic conversation. I really think that is the way that it should happen, an authentic conversation. We talked a lot about, how do we touch upon this subject in a way that's impactful, that's authentic, and that really brings value to our teams. And that led to, first of all, a really long, in discussion. And when I reflected on the conversation and some of the things that we shared, we really shared things that and I've worked for some really great teams, but we really shared some candid, really vulnerable thoughts and feelings that we felt throughout our career. Gary, you shared a story that it really resonated with me because I had the exact same experience. And, I remember getting off that call, and you have those occasionally as you interact with your teams where you just feel like that was a game changer for us. And that conversation for us, while I think we had done a great job of laying a foundation where everyone felt comfortable. And look, we've got a diverse team. We know that we all come from various backgrounds and, and walks of life and so forth. But that conversation really, I walked away from that feeling so energized and so, free and engaged to really be myself and to share, authentically my experiences myself with this team. And that, I think, translated further to, conversations with my team. So it was just really great to see how that played out in practicality. We talked a lot about, hey, this is what we are doing within our teams, but to see how that played out at the leadership team level, and really the conversations that started with that first one and the openness, it was really just a great experience. Something I don't think I've experienced ever in my career. So I walked away from that feeling a little emotional, but also really super, super energized. So it was, it was a good feeling. I think that's kind of, again, what needs to happen as you have these conversations. You're being authentic, you're being vulnerable, you're giving people, a platform to, share their experience and do it candidly.
And I think just to add to that, it's so interesting because I think I think back to the trepidation that, some of our leaders had in us doing this topic. And I think it was that conversation, that openness, that ability that people shared, and we were able to take that, some of us were able to take that in, your experiences, that allowed us to get to this point and just start our own conversation, but this time share it externally, not just internally. We all say we wish we had recorded that conversation, because what a great thing to share with people, that, it can just happen organically, because we had that trust amongst each other. But that's where I think that just start was able to come to where we are now. If originally it was kind of like, well, we can't do this topic. And then when that conversation happened, it was like, we need to do this topic. Yeah. So I thought that was interesting.
I agree. I think, we pulled a lot out of that conversation. And again, I think the key things were we shared actual experiences, and, we didn't want to just kind of be safe. If we're going to tackle, a subject like this, we're going to have some uncomfortable conversations. And that means me having to share experiences, like Mark said, and I'll even share the experience, the folks here is that, for decades, is referred to in a jestful manner, a joking manner, that, hey, Gary, you sound white. People on the phone, when I talk to them or things like that I sound white. And there's a problem there, an inherent problem, because I accepted it. I didn't feel comfortable with it, but I accepted it. It was said in jest, and it kind of built itself up over the years. Well, up until a decade ago, I said, hey, listen, I don't feel comfortable with that. And there's a couple of reasons why I don't feel comfortable with that. Because even in jest, that assumption is that because you're Black, you don't have control of the American English language, right? You have broken dialect, broken English, and that's what defines someone being Black. And then the second part is that you assume that all white people do have that particular control. So you're doing two things that really continue to help spread that misconception and divide a set of people on race. And I know it sounds little, but it's a big thing. And when everyone says it, and Mark mentioned it too, he said, listen, I experienced the same thing. It becomes that, and it becomes real. And, and again, it's not necessarily malicious that these individuals were saying these types of things. It's something that they continue to perpetuate, whether it be joking, and they really do feel that is the case, that all white people sound like they have the best diction and Black people don't. And it's those types of examples that really kind of we need to get out in the open. And I think that was one of the things that we did in that conversation is, hey, let's share experiences and let's not be safe. Let's not talk in generalities. Let's share actual experiences so we can tackle, some of these things. And I think that's what we're really kind of edging people to do and really encouraging people to do, is share those particular experiences that made you feel uncomfortable, or share those experiences that you're ignorant on or don't know about. And so anyway, so I think that those things came from that conversation.
And can I just say, just to link it back to what Casey was talking about with leadership trepidation, I think it wasn't because necessarily there wasn't a belief that this was an important issue or that this is something that leadership cared about. I think it was precisely, Gary, the story that you just shared, which is a story of personal pain, and I think it's one that was shared by others on the call. I think there's a perception that they don't want people to have to relive that, right? They don't want people to have to talk about that. They don't want it for people to feel like they're, they have to share their pain, or that this is somehow a difficult conversation for them. And it is. Like, I don't want to dismiss that. But the point is, I heard Mark say that he left that conversation feeling free, right? So there is this whole set of experiences and this whole set of things that you've experienced that you bring with you into work every day, and you don't get to talk about them. You don't get to air them out unless there's a forum to do that. And you kind of can't move past them from a workplace setting and really address them, not move past them, address them in a workplace setting, unless you're talking about them, right? Mm-hmm. So I do think, there's a real reason to be concerned about tokenizing people of color in your workplace, or making them feel like they need to perform their pain for you. Like, that's not what you should do. But that doesn't mean that shouldn't be a barrier to having an authentic conversation. So I'm just wondering, like, what do you think made it possible for us to have that authentic conversation without going through that, like, feeling it out, what's acceptable, what isn't. But we just share. We were just open. Like, what do you think? What do you think made that possible? And I'll ask Mark that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not something that's done in one shot. I think it's a build over time. I've been with the team for 2 years. I know a number of you have been here, a bit longer than that. But I think for me, what I've experienced is, we interact with one another openly and candidly and honestly, always. And I think that sets the foundation. We're all, we not only are we professionally, observing our differences and our styles and so forth, but we also bring ourselves to work. And I think, organically that's happened. Thinking back to the conversation that we had, the first one that we should, we should have recorded. I like the comment that came out of that from, our most senior leader at the time. And that was, we were kind of struggling with, well, how do you say this? How do you tell this story? And she said, when you struggle with what to say, tell the truth. And that was, one of the most it was a simple statement, but it was easily one of the most brilliant, statements. And I think really set the tone for how that conversation happened and how we move forward with, subsequent conversations. And there's really not a lot of thought that I think needs to go into what do you say, because again, you tell the truth, you tell your experience, and we live that on that conversation. I think we've always done it, but we articulated it, we brought that concept to life. And that's how we've approached all, our conversations on this topic. So I think it happened organically, somewhat maybe unintentionally through that brilliant statement. And we've lived and we've breathed that.
It's so.
I think it takes.
Go
ahead.
Go ahead.
Casey.
Okay, I was just going to say.
Look at this. This is look at these respectful colleagues. We'll go.
Normally we
so
just
much
talk
energy
over
now.
each other.
We'll go Casey and then Gary.
But,
I'm just traffic cop.
But no, it's so interesting because Gary, when I hear you tell that story and how you said at first you didn't have the courage to say anything, and then you found the courage and you spoke up, that was your just start moment. Like, I feel like that was your just start moment. And I think we all need to find our just start moments. And I think organizations need to find their just start moments, but that was yours. And it's so exciting to hear you share it, because then that's going to encourage someone else to just start and share and then be able to share their moment of when they just started. Like, I think, Mark, to that
you let Casey go first and she takes the point.
I stole your thunder.
Yeah, no, it's brilliantly said, because exactly, it takes the first person. How do you get into those conversations? And it takes one person to share their experience. And typically, if it comes from someone in a position of influence, a leader, that it kind of cascades into, okay, great, you know what? He's sharing or she's sharing their experiences, their true experiences. And it just takes one to actually start to unfold that. And I think that we did that. And we have I think that our team is just completely diverse, amazing folks. We all get along. But even when that example was shared, we continued to share examples because we felt comfortable in doing so, because one person did it. And I think that it takes one person. And typically, if it's a leader and if it's in a type of environment where you're making people feel safe, you're talking about your own mistakes, you're talking about your own experiences, I think it does make people feel comfortable to share more. So
can I share my sort of just start moment from that call? Because I think it's instructive for, like, white leaders, right? Particularly because I came to that conversation with, my woke Instagram and reading all about, like, how do you get past the failed D&I practices at your workplace? And I'm like, I'm leading the charge. I'm going to win this thing. And everything I was reading was like, don't listen, white person, don't center yourself in the D&I narrative. And I'm like, okay, operationalize this. So I said on that call, like, I don't think I'm the right person. I think my voice is the one that's needed here. And I felt very good about myself because I centered myself in the narrative. And both Mark and Gary were like, no, you're not putting this all on our shoulders. Like, you're not putting the people out of color out there and you get to hide behind the scenes. Like, that's not how this works. And I tell you that story because, number one, I was wrong. But number two, for a second, my inclination was to be like, but I read that. I'm supposed to decenter myself. And I think it's important when you are engaging in this conversation to just approach it with humility and know that like you might get some things wrong. And if people are gracious and kind enough and care about you enough to tell you like, that's not right, here's what I would actually ask of you. I think that's an important piece of doing this right, where you can't assume that you have all the answers. You can't expect that your experience or your understanding of other people's experiences are the real deal. And you should be prepared to listen to them. And you should be prepared to hear some things that you might find personally confronting, but know that that's a gift.
Mhm.
Mhm.
I love that. The gift.
And here's the deal. I think that, everyone's input, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of age, everyone's input in a cohesive, diverse environment is equally valuable, right? In my opinion, I think that another thing is that the judgmental part has to stop, right? Because you have to have an opportunity for people to talk through. And just like Jeremiah said, hey, look, this is what I read. This is what you can't be judgmental when people are offering their souls. You just cannot. And I think that, that's going to be equally important as you're talking. This isn't a Salem Hunt witch trials or McCarthyism. It's not like, oh, great, now you qualify as being racist because of that thought. That's not really the thought process here. Now, feel bad about yourself, right? That's not really what the accomplishment is. The accomplishment is really learning more about each other. And so the judgmental piece has to be really kind of important here in making sure that as we are sharing these thoughts, that the judgmental piece needs to kind of go away, right? We need to kind of look at it in an open lens. So we appreciate Jeremiah sharing his thoughts, but there's no way we were going to have this podcast without Jeremiah. We thought that he would be definitely the best fit for this podcast.
Brilliant moderation.
Absolutely. 100%.
But I like Jeremiah. I
Not to mention, Jeremiah likes to get out of everything, so we're like, no way, So,
Jeremiah, I like what you alluded to in your story, and that is that look, you're going to get things wrong along the way. You're going to learn, and I think that's the important thing. Clearly, there's a methodology for how you approach diversity, inclusion, equality, belonging, and so forth in the workplace. There's a process for how that happens, but there are also nuance within that process that you just have to learn from. You have to adapt and adjust to, where your organization is in their journey to really make it work. But you also have to your point, feel okay with maybe not getting it 100% right and learning along the way. That's, I think, the most important thing.
And that's right, because no organization has gotten it 100% right.
Absolutely.
Right. So you have to assume because of that there's still things that we need to change and things that we need to shift. So if you're married to an orthodoxy around this is how we do it and this is how we must do it and there's no other way to do this, then you're probably gonna miss some things because you're not listening.
I was just gonna say that, Jeremiah. It's so funny. I could finish your sentence there because I think that's it. I think that's it.
So now you go after Jeremiah. Right? You steal my point, but then you go after Jeremiah. I'm kidding. Go ahead.
No, I love that. It's the listening thing because, like, I think you put a plan in place and then you roll it out and then it doesn't fly exactly how you expect it's going to. But if you don't then take feedback from people in your organization to understand where did we miss the mark, like you can't just keep rolling it out and keep rolling, going to the next step if you didn't get the first step right. And so I think that's just so key in stage by stage. And it's interesting that you shared your story because I said on a couple of podcasts ago that I wasn't impacted, and I haven't been impacted directly necessarily, but I think of experiences on my teams, and one that really stood out for me was, Mark, one that you had shared about MBA recruitment and how a lot of the hiring managers, if it's an African-American candidate, would say the first thing out of their mouth would say they have excellent communication skills. And yet they wouldn't say that about any of the other Caucasian candidates. And I was like, wow, I may not have recognized that as bias. Like and now that you said that, I think, oh my gosh, I put myself back in those situations. I think, wow, I just didn't know enough to recognize that. it didn't make me feel necessarily any particular way, but now I recognize it. And now I know there's probably people within my team that would feel a certain way hearing that. And, that story has just, since we had that conversation and you shared that story, it's been something I've been thinking a lot about. And so I think listening is such a big key in this process.
Yeah, and what Gary, alluded to, and when you told your story, and that is having the courage to speak up. It did take some. It's throughout my career, I've heard that, by the way, and I've seen that difference, and not just in the one instance that I shared. Again, where we're debriefing on candidates and we're talking about capabilities and skills and so forth, and the first thing that you hear about an African American candidate is, oh, he's well spoken, and and there were times where I would just kind of shake my head like, well, he doesn't have a brain injury. He should be well spoken.
Right.
So, but really it took some time to get the courage to, really speak up and say, look, let's look at the profiles the same way, right? We didn't say that about any other candidate. So, let's look at the talent in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's a sense of humility that we all have to be prepared for. I think, Jeremiah, you kind of touched on that when we're having these conversations, because on both sides, right? For some reason, there was a sense of humility in terms of me sharing that experience about people saying that about me, right? And me even accepting it, for the longest period of time. And once we establish that and get over that humility or that sense of humility, expect it, I think it's easier to kind of share. Another thing I wanted to point out, Casey, to your point, when you talked about, hey, I probably witnessed a degree of, prejudice, and I didn't necessarily recognize it as such, right? And again, we talked about this in the call after the call that we probably should have recorded, but we talked about this, and we talk about, as soon as we throw those words out there, we start thinking about, the pointy white sheets, right? The Ku Klux Klan, the skin. We start thinking of the extremist, right? And that's not really what we're focusing on, right? We're focusing on ignorance. We're focusing on individuals like maybe you, Casey, or Jeremiah, and even me and Mark. We're focusing on those individuals that are practicing it or accepting it or witnessing it without knowing. And that's the group that we're really looking at. So when we talk about, hey, we want to try to improve, our concept. We want to try to improve, the way we absorb information. We're not saying, you're an extremist. We're just saying that you're in that group, and it's such a large group, and all of us have been there, and all of us continue to go there. That's the group that we're really looking at when we talk about these things and we talk about these conversations.
Yeah, look, and it's the reality that so back to the point about me thinking like, oh, I shouldn't engage in this. Like, it is exactly the opposite, right? Like, ultimately, racial equity in the workplace, because let's be honest, white folks are the dominant group in the workplace. Like, it is our problem to solve. So if we don't engage in it, that problem isn't going to get solved. And so, I think what Casey just shared is an example of like what happens when you stop assuming that this is somebody else's fight to fight, where you engage in, like, really put yourself into the thick of things, and start to hear your colleagues and start to learn some things and start to incorporate what you learn into how you approach your daily work, which is an excellent segue into our next discussion, which is about that. How do you, now that you've actually started this conversation, what do you do with that? How do you make sure that you're listening fully and thoughtfully, and that you are actually learning from what you're hearing from your colleagues and from your team? So with that, I look forward to that discussion, and I thank my dear colleagues, Mark Rogers, Gary Jones, and Casey Butler, for joining me today. It was a pleasure as always, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. As always, everyone, be safe. All right.
Yes.
Thanks.
Have a good one, folks.
Bye. All right, guys, that was good.
Thank you for joining Hudson RPO's Just Start podcast series. We look forward to hearing from you for any questions or feedback at juststart@hudsonrpo.com. And we look forward also to you joining the next podcast in our Just Start series.